Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone.
Bonjour à tous. Alors, vous avez tous
Good
regardé.
afternoon. So you've all watched the film Zurich, a documentary by Iweala about humanitarian aid in Haiti, which will be a great start to interrogate ourselves about the ongoing philosophy in cooperation, what we call public aid to development. Welcome for those of you who just got here. Welcome to those of you watching us live. I will call our panelists who will debate with us about the question we'll ask today: should we end aid and cooperation in Africa, or should we need to find a way to make it relevant? I will call Gilles Carbonnier, who is a professor of economy and development, and who works at the Institute for Development, and also at the International Red Cross. Also, Olivia Umurerwa Rutazibwa, who's a politologue and assistant professor in human rights at the London School of Economics, which looks into particularly in the ongoing myth in international policies. We will question all of this with her. Welcome.
Uzodinma Iweala.
Uzodinma Iweala, writer, sociologue, filmmaker. You might have seen him on Netflix. He's Firm. The first feature film on Netflix, Beast of No Nation. This is the gentleman who has written it based on his story. Let's welcome him. And also, last but not least, Ragnimwendé Eldaa Koama Entrepreneure, conference giver, and also an agitator of ideas. You participated in the Africa-France summit in Montpellier in October, and you really did rock the boat. Welcome.
Alors peut-être une question pour
maybe one question to get us started while we wait for your microphones to arrive. We've all watched a film, including yourselves. It is not a film in itself about public aid to development. It is a film about humanitarian aid, as you've seen, but it allows us to work with the philosophy of our subject. And I have a question for each of you, which I will ask you to answer in just a few words. Do you have a feeling that public aid for development cooperation is based on the same principle as humanitarian aid? Gilles. Welcome. Well, you were starting with a big question in itself, but I will try to be brief in answering it. I have been very touched by this film, which is like a documentary, and what was said in this car was very touching by the different passengers, that we are looking into fundamental issues in regards to aid. And as I said, it is the question of the trade, an international trade system, the question of political incidences, and the question of aid that substitute aid and local structures, in which, when they leave behind extremely fragile systems that have suffered from the presence of international aid. And there is the whole matter of informal economies. And I was touched by the testimonies, the fact that these women play a key role in local economy. They've left agriculture behind, but they're yet not part of formal economy and of priorities. These are all things that have very much touched me, but there are theoretically great difference between a humanitarian aid and development aid. In practice, there is one main difference: short-term emergency help, and whereas development aid is long-term aid. Very often we have very long-term crises, and this criteria no longer is one. And the first is that humanitarian aid is an external aid, whereas aid to development usually ought to be local actors who pilot the aid and how it's invested, but it is not often the case in neither of those cases. And the other aspect which is important is that humanitarian aid ought to go directly to those who have the most urgent and pressing needs, without any distinction and without any conditions. The humanitarian aid ought to be unconditional, whereas aid to development often is conditional. And I feel feel that this is the only distinction that remains. If we look today at the situation in Afghanistan, humanitarian aid must be brought immediately to the 40 million Afghans, including a majority of children and adolescents who no longer have access to health care, no longer have access to the possibility of an income, and therefore cannot plan their future. And this ought to be unconditional, whereas we see the development aid as completely pulled back from the country for political reasons that which one may find legitimate or not, and all linked to the Taliban regime. So that is the one criteria that ought to remain. But once more, a very interesting film which I've seen that raises a number of questions. Thank you very much, Gilles, and we'll have the opportunity to develop this further. But I ask you the question, Olivia, about your reaction to this film.
The thing that really touched me was that it doesn't often happen that the microphone is given to the people that are supposedly the beneficiaries of all this aid, whether it's humanitarian or the more long-term development aid. And what always strikes me is that, and I'm saying this dwelling in the university on a daily basis, but thinking that we develop so many theories and we lay it out quite clearly with the right concepts or whatever. But often our analysis does not cover the actual everyday realities. So if we ask the question, the huge difference between humanitarian aid or long-term development aid, I think a lot of people on the receiving end would maybe not make the same distinction, because they might experience it as a longer continuity of similar logics, where there is a reproduction of people being dependent on the so-called goodwill of others, either to come long-term or to come short-term, to interpret it as a political task or conditionally, or whether they give it out of the goodness of their heart. The realities are often quite different from what actually happens. So I think that for me was the powerful aspect of this movie, is that you just sit and have people discuss. I mean, it's staged, and also some of the people that were speaking, meaning others weren't. But I think, for me, this is a powerful document that I would put at least next to, if not first, before any of the other big theories that we might teach about development aid, because you save so much time and cut through a lot of the BS by just going straight to, it's not working, and it's not because somebody's nice or not nice. It hasn't been working for a really, really long time, and people know. So I think it shows that they are the experts much more than many of us are studying or even trying to help.
Uzo?
Yeah. First, I want to just applaud the film. I mean, I think it's not just in terms of what was said, but it was a beautifully shot film, I think, like, just from an aesthetic perspective. And I actually think that's really, really important, because it takes you a little bit out of where you are and puts you into another realm while you're seeing all of this happen. I mean, just the idea of the whole film essentially taking place from the back of a truck, I think is really, really important, just as a setup for it. And I say that also as somebody, in terms of taking you out of the theory and into the practice. I mean, I started off as somebody who, in essence, like very much admired this form of work. And I also started my career. I have a medical degree. I worked in public health for quite some time in different places across the continent. And so spent a lot of time actually in one of these, these Zorekans, basically. And I think the idea of just like the bifurcated consciousness, especially if you are somebody from one of these places, to both want so much better for the place that you're from, to think of this as a pathway towards that improvement, but then to also be so exposed to all of the flaws of that way of thinking and that means of doing things. I think this film captures that incredibly, incredibly well. And I think as you said, as a document, I think it's very powerful in that sense. I also think that it's part of like a long line of films of this nature. While watching from a feature standpoint or a fictional standpoint, it calls, I don't know, how many of you have seen Abdulrahman Sissako's Bamako? as a film. If you haven't, you should watch it. It's a feature film. But in that film, they essentially put the World Bank and the IMF on trial. That's the conceit of the film. And I think this is a very similar fashion where it's people from a place speaking directly to the inadequacies of a system that is both, you know, on one hand has the veneer of being set up to help, but that is very much designed in the service of perpetuating a system that allows for gross extraction, and that on one hand claims to humanize, but on the other hand is very much intent on perpetuating a system that, again, that was built, like literally from its foundations, constructed off of the dehumanization of a certain set of people. And nowhere is that seen like sort of better than in this film, especially when they're talking about essentially like who's killed, who was taken away, and how that's connected, that struggle, which people would consider an internal Haitian, like example of Haitian dysfunction, is actually very much connected to the wider world that the film itself puts together. And I think it really just puts that on full blast and full display, and I think is great in that sense.
Thank you. Eldaa, Ragnimwendé, je vous donne la parole peut-être pour...
Eldaa Ragnimwendé, I'll give you the floor so you can react to this film. Thank you very much, Dominique. Thanks to everyone who is here to participate to this exchange. I think it is a film which has made me smile sometime, which has also given me the impression that we finally are aware of the other side of the coin. So much publicity is done about the good intention of humanitarian aid, development aid, and to finally give the floor to those who are supposed to beneficiate from it, as it was said before, and to realize that there are many questions. There are people who do not appreciate the process as much, and there are people who actually do not want to speak on these matters. I've listened with great attention to what the driver has said. The driver said, "I'm focusing on the road." It doesn't mean that he doesn't have an opinion, but the matter is whether the conditions are there for him to say what he thinks without endangering his work and his ability to meet his needs and to have an income. It's an interesting film because it raises questions. And at the same time, I'd like to bounce back on your question about whether there is difference between humanitarian aid and development aid. Well, on principle, the words are different. Humanitarian aid and development aid are two different matters. And also, when I look at the targets are almost the same. Why do I say almost? Because it is an aid which is directed to persons whom we believe are in need of help. But it is not necessarily the case, because every human being, whatever their daily struggle is or their daily life is first of all has a survival instinct, and everyone is able to figure things out in a situation of danger. Some have quicker response than others. But when I see this type of aid, humanitarian aid, development aid, it is as if there were people who were looking at a situation, having their own analysis, deciding that it is urgent to help, without taking into account whether it might be possible for the individual to be resilient. No one waits to see if the person may be resilient. We do an analysis of the situation and react. And towards the end of the film, we hear someone say, "Should we vote for a president because of their goodwill?" And I'll bring the question back to humanitarian aid and development aid. Is it because someone has the goodwill to help someone? Should we just open our arms and greet them and thank them? I hope we'll answer this question together.
Well, we will at least try. We will try to tackle these issues freely, as you mentioned, and as you did in the France-Africa Summit in Montpellier last autumn. Public development aid Gilles Carbonnier will be able to tell us more about this, but it is several $1 billion for Africa. By development aid, we also include various types of loans. So that is a lot of money, many billions, but what do we get done with that money? So that is the question that you raised to the French president. Let's have a look at the film.
Vidéo, normalement elle doit bientôt arriver. C'était
video should be coming up in a second. It was in Montpellier in October.
Monsieur le Président, l'aide, tant qu'elle n'aide pas, tant qu'elle n'amène pas à se départir de l'aide, comme le dit Thomas Sankara, il faut s'en débarrasser. Car l'aide, ce type d'aide-là, rend esclave.
Mr. President, that type of aid makes us slaves. It prevents local populations to make use of their own resources. You should know that. The best is within us, within each of us.
Feu Joseph Kizerbo, un intellectuel africain.
To quote Joseph Kizerbo, the late Joseph Kizerbo, I'm sure you read a lot, Mr. President, I'm sure you know him. He said, you do not develop, you develop ourselves. And if you don't develop yourselves, if you don't develop ourselves, we can't support development. For over half a century, development aid has been going around Africa, and as we've seen, it doesn't bear any fruit.
Voilà, toujours autant de succès cette séquence qui était une des séquences fortes.
Wonderful sequence. It was a highlight of this summit, and it's an opportunity for me to come back to this question. Gilles Carbonnier, you're a development economist. What can you tell us about public development aid and economic cooperation? How does it work now, and why doesn't it actually work? Well, you mentioned the main tenets, but we should put this in perspective. Development aid coming from the OECD countries, that's a little bit above $150 billion per year. That sounds a lot, but compared to military expenditure, that is almost nothing. It's not much compared to remittances. It's not much compared to transnational companies' investments in developing countries. It is really not much, especially as we consider that around 50% of that aid is not directly translated into aid in the country, but it covers salaries and various fees and what we call the welcome fees for asylum seekers. So it's quite marginal. Apart from maybe after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, where suddenly NGOs, international organizations arrived on the island massively. And suddenly the island is in the spotlight. And we'll be able to come back to that later, but it wasn't a success, far from it. So how does it work? You have various entities that fund multilateral institutions, and it also goes through bilateral instruments. So bilateral aid is a foreign policy instrument. For example, when a country has objectives. For example, in Switzerland, we have objectives which are enshrined in the constitutions, promoting peace, equality, and so on. And then each country wants to promote their own interests, political interests, commercial interests, and so on. And they use these instruments to promote them. So the question is to know what motivates countries to spend over $150 billion in what we call development aid. I think we have to move away from this approach, from this concept, and we have to move towards cooperation and partnership, co-creation. And I think in my field, my research field, it's been 5 years already. I've been co-directing a research project between Ghana, Laos, and Peru. And our project focuses on reducing illicit financial flows related to raw material trade. So we're working with authorities, coffee producers, gold producers, in order to better understand illicit financial flows in order to reduce them and to allow Ghana to make more money from cacao and gold export. And what was really interesting is that we started this project just when the president of Ghana had launched a project called Ghana Beyond Aid, and he wanted to make it bigger and make it Africa Beyond Aid. And the objective of this is for countries to make the most of their own resources. So behind development aid, you have political issues, you have power plays, and this is something that we need to shed light on and to understand. So we need to understand the various fault lines and the adverse effect of development aid. Olivia, I noticed you were nodding when Gilles was speaking. You know a lot about adverse effects of development. What can you tell us about it?
I think I've come to a point where maybe in addition to understanding the mechanisms and how it works, I would say that it might be important, first of all, for us to identify from which position we're participating in this conversation. So let's assume I consider myself a person in Europe, European. I think that conversation might be different than if I'm talking to my friends and family in Rwanda, right? So let's say that the comments I'm giving now is very much from that point of view, because often from our good intentions, we anticipate the future as if we're already all equal and all starting from this clean slate where we're all in the same position in terms of who's benefiting from the system we have today and those who aren't. So that would be my first thing to say. If we have this conversation in, let's say, the global north, the place on earth that continues to benefit from a colonial past, I think it's important for us to let go of the idea that anything we've just discussed actually merits the label aid. So, and I think it's a call to historicize what we're talking about. We're not just talking in the present where miraculously some people are poor and others are rich, some work hard, others don't, and then those that are nice that go out and help them. We are speaking of a history that created that inequality and created poverty on the one side and wealth on the other. And so if you historicize and politicize it, then speaking from the north, it becomes almost obscene, or it's quite violent to call this aid. You go somewhere, you rob it blind, you kill lots of people, you turn around, you forget everything that happened, and then you say, I'll come and help you. The reason why this is important, it's not just a word, is that you create a particular, and it was mentioned, you create a particular relation of power when you say, I come and help you, because it comes with, first of all, the condition whether I feel like it. Maybe today I do it, tomorrow I don't. But also I will define what your priorities might be, but also I will define what that aid should look like, and probably also what a civilized version of your society would look like. And that's why when we say that the whole aid system today, regardless of the good or bad intentions of the individuals that work within it, is a reproduction or a continuation of a colonial system of governance or logic where we design who is civilized and who isn't, apart from exploitation, extraction, and all of that. And then we code that in a whole system of benevolence where we will try and help you to get to that particular image of aid. So all of this to say, not that we can't do anything or everybody should stay home and not care about each other, but if we are genuine about what the actual aims could be of this cooperation, which means more fair global system, eradication of poverty, hopefully, and all of the other things. If you think about it from the position of the North, and I'm generalizing, then we can try and think, what would it look like if we stopped calling it aid and say, we need to engage in relationships of repair and reparations. And once you do that, you understand that you have, I think especially for us in the North, for a while we might have to be much more silent and actually listen very carefully, and the movie is an example. People know what they need, but not just need. It's actually people, or we should be able to distill what we need to give back. It's about restitution, it's not about aid. And I think, and I think that would change already a lot of the conversation that we're supposed to have.
Olivia, peut-être pour aller un petit peu plus loin dans ce que vous dites, vous parlez de ce regard colonial.
If you want to go even further, you're talking about this colonial point of view. And Gilles, you mentioned the power relationship, the fact that there is a dissymmetry between those who provide aid and those who receive it. You're talking, Olivia, sometimes about this colonial outlook and the fact that development aid and cooperation is a philosophy which is inspired from this civilization mission of the West.
Qu'a évoqué Olivia. Est-ce que c'est cela?
Uzodinma, about reparations, is it the way forward, or do we just need to change the narrative for aid to work? What should be done for aid to actually work?
A two-part question, right? If I, first of all, I just want to co-sign on everything you said because you came with the fire. Second, before I hit on the what we need to change for it to work, I think just to buttress Olivia's point about the need for like a historical understanding of the situation, which I think you laid it out brilliantly. I also just want to go back into, and this is something we talked about earlier today when we had our discussion. Just this idea is of terms themselves and sort of the sort of like, I guess, epistemological foundations of this whole situation. So very briefly, just to think about, and I said this earlier, so for those of you who were here earlier, I apologize, but I'll repeat it because I think it's really, really important. If you think about this idea of development and you think about the ideas of progress as emerging from an Enlightenment sort of foundation, I think that's a starting point in terms of how we think about all of this, right? So the fact or the idea that you can order the world in a certain way, right, where some people are more advanced, other people are less advanced, and this idea of development, this idea of progress is also very much it's on the foundation of on a very racist foundation, right? That was developed again during that same period, during that same Enlightenment period, you know, during that period when people started thinking about evolution and whatnot, where you have some people or some versions of humans that are more advanced and other versions of humans that are, and I'm just going to use this word to be real about it, more animalistic, and therefore we can bring them up. Now that was also very much tied to the Industrial Revolution and its development, right? This idea that to be able to extract resources from a certain place, you had to necessarily type them or define them as less developed, right? So this is where all this comes out of, and that terminology has been brought out into the present day to allow for the continuing exploitation of certain places, peoples, geographies, that allows for this system that Olivia was talking about to exist. That's point one. Point two is just to buttress something that she was saying. the wealth gaps that we see today, and people like to use the term developed or developing countries, and I hate those terms. I much prefer rich and poor countries. I even hate the term industrialized and non-industrialized. Again, I think because some of these definitions are a little bit too loose, but rich and poor countries, let's use that. Why are the countries rich, as you were saying, versus why are some countries poor? And we'll forget the resource, like the hard resource extraction. Let's talk about labor, right, extraction. So of course, if you go to somebody's place and you get them to work for you for free and you essentially take their wages, and then invest those wages in the place in the betterment of your own house, that's going to compound over time. You will have that much more money, right? Which means you can then decide what to do with the disposable income that you have. That's the situation that we're in. So we're talking about a wealth gap that's based off of unpaid labor, right? Extracted labor from time, right? And that's an important thing to think about. So again, to go back to this idea of you steal the output of somebody's labor, then you turn around and go back to them and say, okay, here, I'm gonna give you 25 cents, I'll give you $1, I'll give you $150 billion if that's the number that we're looking at, which pales in comparison to, forget again the material extraction. We're just talking about the extraction of compounded over time of the fruits of someone's labor. I think that's what just needs to be said before I go on to the second part of your question, which is, can we improve the system? This is something that I write about a lot, and I don't know if it is a question of improving the system so much as it is reordering the system, and I think that's what gets a lot of people confused or agitated, especially because, agitated, I say that, especially when people think that the system is one that's constructed from again, founded on these Enlightenment principles of cosmopolitism, sort of universality and all that sort of stuff that people believe in but don't actually believe in, right? So can you fix the system? I don't think you can fix this system, because fixing the system means asking one very fundamental question, which is, how much are you ready to actually pay for the life that you live, right? That's the question I think that's really, really important, because if we're all gonna sit here and say we're okay to live lives that are based off of somebody else's extracted labor, then you can, make tweaks here and there, and everybody can move on and we'll be fine. But if we sit down and say, how much does the way that we live in the West or in the global North, whatever the term it is you want, how much does it actually cost? And what's that cost environmentally? What's that cost in terms of what you're asking other people to pay for your existence? Then all of a sudden that question becomes much, much harder to answer, because it's like, well, what am I ready and willing to give up, right? So this film, I think, is really important because it shows, very clearly, right, it shows two things. One, the humanity of people. And I don't mean humanity in the sense that we all think about when, you see these videos of people, dying or in abject poverty or whatever, and you're like, oh, they're humans too. I mean humanity in the sense that people are thinking, people have real thoughts and ideas about about what's really going on, and could actually debate you if given the chance. That's something that I think people don't really want to hear. That's number one. And number two in this is again, just going back to that question, is like, are you really, really willing to have a real radical change in the way that you construct and order your life in order for this system to change? So that's the sort of short answer to your question of how do we improve the system. You don't. It's not about improving a system of aid. It's about first, and I think the idea of reparations or restitution, that's the key point first, which is saying, this is not aid. It's actually, I owe you this money, right? I very much owe you this money. Concrete example, and then I'll be quiet. I was in London with my mom, who will actually probably be speaking on Friday, I think. I'm sure she has a lot of stuff to say about this. This was maybe, this was years ago now, 2005, and we were driving down sort of Whitehall with all the British government buildings, and I remember saying to her, this is what Nigeria needs. We need some kind of monumental architecture, for whatever reason. My mom just looked at me and was like, you poor thing, we paid for this, right? And I think that's really, really important to think about. We paid for the system that exists here today, and therefore it's not a let me help you, it's actually the bill has come due. And that bill can come due in an orderly fashion, or it can come due in a very disorderly fashion. And I think, unfortunately, we're going towards a disorderly payment system rather than an orderly one.
Peut-être une question supplémentaire, Uzo.
An additional question, to Uzo and Olivia. You are carrying the voice of those who were in the film who will not have the opportunity to speak, but whom you represent with your ideas. You've spoken of this colonial aid, and the question is clearly, is development aid, could we make a distinction between development aid of former colonial powers, France and the UK and others, and development aid that other countries can give, such as Germany and Switzerland? Is it for you the same thing? Does it participate in the same way? Is this a civilizing mission that countries have? Is it just as present whether the country was a colonial power or not?
To understand or to specify what we mean when we say we need to have a historical consciousness, it's not just literally at the level of nation states, and we often have this conversation in the classroom. So I am from Belgium and Rwanda as well, but I teach in the UK. And so when in Belgium we have conversation about colonialism, they say like, oh, but at least we're not like the Brits, you know, they were everywhere, the sun never set. And then in the UK they would say, but at least we're not like Leopold II and he chopped off hands and stuff. I say this with humor, but the reflex that we have to try and compare our colonial histories almost to see who was worse than the other, which is problematic in and of itself, actually kind of misses the point that both the system of slavery and colonialism was a shared global system, that even if you did not have your direct colonies, let's say, you were not outside of it, but also the wealth that you accumulated did not require you to have maybe a direct colony. And there is no better example than Switzerland, obviously. So a lot of the financial, just the whole, yeah, let me just say financials, just all the wealth that a country like Switzerland sits on is one that is predicated on the adventures that Leopold had in the Congo, right? It happened at the same time and it's part of the same logic. Similarly, I think a lot of people would say, and we see the conversations now in Scandinavian countries, they're like, oh, but at least we weren't that bad. We only, you know, Denmark obviously very, very quickly falls out of that conversation, but in people's consciousness, they feel like at least they were not as bad as France. But the thing is that in many different ways, a lot of the industrialization, the flows of monies, the developments of the societies, but also the movements of people. So you have a massive emigration of Scandinavian people to the New World at some point in history, not that long ago even, that actually managed also to finance, at the most dire moments, the economies in the Scandinavian countries, right? And so it's really important to look at it not at the nation state level, but as a global system of governance that we reproduce in many different ways in the present. So when we think about reparations, I think what is important, and that's also why I often say also repair, is that it's not just about can we calculate how much money we owe them? We should also do that, by the way. But it's also what are the practices that we do today that are just exactly the same, but just under different names and with different responsibilities attached to them. So the idea of repair should really be about, and that's also why I turn now to the language of abolition, because it shocks us enough and helps us to think beyond reform. But what is it that we need to get rid of? And I would say at the most basic level is the way we are socialized to find it okay that some human lives, not just human life, but some lives are worth saving, or some lives are worth protecting, and others are not. And that is in the most basic, everyday choices, and sometimes not choices, but stuff that we just let happen. And I think it's cruel and painful to see, but the most recent refugee crisis that we see developing around Ukraine shows us two things. That on the one hand, we still reproduce this idea that some people suffering, and then even journalists saying literally blonde hair, blue eyes, stuff like that, shocks us more than others. But at the same time, when we think people are part of us, suddenly we create this even political capacity to let people in and preserve their lives in dignity. It's not even that we say you can come in. The European Union is saying, we'll give you residency for 2-3 years. You actually have the right to work, so you can keep your dignity and make sure that you're part of our society. And we assume that at some point you would want to go back because everybody likes to live in their country. It's something that we do not seem to be able to extend to everyone. And I think that's the deeply racist nature of our global order that needs to be part of when we think of reparations. It's not just let's calculate and give it back, but when are we going to stop to reproduce colonial logics that we've inherited and that we prefer not to talk about, and we go straight into the present and say, how can I help?
Can I just piggyback on this? Just to say, I also want to make sure that we don't let certain countries off the hook here. Just to very specifically, because I think people forget, and that's, again, the history is so important. We forget the role that the Germans had to play, and that's just because they lost World War I, first of all, and had to give up, quote unquote, give up, I can't even believe I say that, had to relinquish, give up, whatever, part with some of their quote unquote colonial possessions. Tanzania, you know, Namibia, we forget that in a lot of ways, Namibia was practice for what happened here on the continent during World War II. Cameroon was another country, or, you know, again, an area that the Germans perpetrated all kinds of nonsense in. You know, I think you've already taken the Swiss to task, you know. So, and then, you know, I'll also just say that it's so important, I think, again, to recognize that idea of what it, like, who is or who is considered human and not human, as a very, very sort of like basic point that we're talking about here. And I don't think, I just want to repeat it because I don't think that it can be stressed enough that this whole debate is in a word nonsense without that as a fundamental starting point. And I don't think that we start there often enough.
Merci Uzodinma. Alors Uzodinma, Olivia, vous avez travaillé beaucoup sur cette question de réparation et on va y venir.
Thank you, Uzodinma. And Olivia, you work very often. Uzodinma, you often work on this question of reparation, as does Olivia, and to understand how this system must be changed and what needs to be thrown away, what needs to be renovated. And we think that this seems to be the general opinion. But before we decide how it can be changed, notably by taking into account this question of reparation, I'd like to see with you, Ragnimwendé, as an entrepreneur, as a woman working on the ground, I'd like to understand how on the ground this public aid for development, how it affects or limits the lives of entrepreneurs. Have you been a witness or have you been a victim of what we see in the film, meaning that an aid which limits agriculture, entrepreneurial activities? I have been waiting for a while to bounce back on the questions you've asked earlier, but I will try to be precise and direct in my answer by first saying that when we look at development aid or humanitarian aid, if you'd like, we perceive it as a solution which we bring to someone in need. This is what motivates people. When I look at my own situation, I think that I'm living well, I have this or that, and therefore when I'm shown images of someone else, I think that if this person was living as I do, perhaps they would feel better, perhaps they would be more fulfilled. But in reality, we do not know what this person is experiencing. And this is what motivates people more and more in believing that they must help others develop. I would like to take a very simple example because I like to illustrate my thoughts. Imagine that you are in your apartment here in Switzerland and you have a problem, perhaps with your gas. And the neighbors are informed of this problem, and everyone comes and knocks and says, "Hi, I hear that you have a problem with your gas line. Can I help you?" And the first person will show you what to do. And then the neighbors' will come and say, "Hi, I've heard you had a problem with your gas line. This is the solution I propose." and so on and so forth, and other neighbors, and each neighbor comes and proposes a solution with great intention because they have known how to manage their own gas, and they feel that their experience ought to be adequate for you and will help you do well. But in the end, how many solutions do you have for a single gas problem? Many. This leads you to constantly be thinking of which solution should I implement, and this may take more time than if perhaps you had taken 5 minutes on your own to think about your problem and deal with it. And this is, I think, what makes it so today that many countries come in with their own approach to help African countries. Someone comes and says, oh, I think this is best. And as an example, we have many projects which are oriented towards professional insertion, integration of the youth entrepreneurial activity, and I've been consulted in a number of these programs, and sometimes at the end of the day I smile because I think this person thinks that this will be adequate, but we do not know. Why do we not let these people whom you want to help, why do we not let them think? Why do we don't let them express their ideas, try things out, and then see how they go? Because everyone thinks they have a solution. And in the entrepreneurial sector, I've seen many programs come with concepts which we know do not correspond to the needs, but that we still force upon people. And then we want through introduction speeches, we want people to be grateful for such and such structure, for accompanying your initiative. You needed investments have come. Can we applaud such and such structure? And everyone claps and claps and claps. And then we do reports and we say we've given so many millions to so many youth. They will start with small initiatives. They will leave the informal sector. And we publicized it so much, and 10 years later, we do not come back to see if things have worked, to see if this person is now autonomous or whether the person is in a vicious circle of requesting more aid, because I know entrepreneurs who do not do the work of their company. They want to have business plans that will help them win project bids. Because if there is a project for people who work in culture, someone will drop their, for instance, their proposal here, and their proposal will win, and they're able to put together a great offer, a great proposal, and we'll bring a similar offer. The other person will bring a similar offer, and we keep collecting aids. And what is my business? My business is to pass my request for aid from investor to investor, and I can pay the salary of my employers while I focus on the next opportunity. Is this what you could consider helping someone develop? Isn't it just showing this person an easy way for someone to work in their country, takes a bit of resources, and then say, oh, I will help them, and we are prepared to wait and for that help? It creates dependence. I have said it, and I would like to repeat it here. Because in the end, people learn from their mentors, they learn from people who have preceded them, they learn that they need to have external investments, they need to make sure that they can obtain these investments, because the examples of those who have developed without aid are not put forward, they're not spoken about. I am sorry to say so. As far as I'm concerned, when I started my business, I didn't ask for any help, neither from the state nor from any NGO, because I truly wanted to see that whether when one is young and one is starting a business, the question is whether we need help. And it worked. Do you feel that your process of not asking for any help, was it more efficient? Yes, it was wonderful. It was excellent. We've existed for 2 years. Yesterday, on March 5th, 2022, my business was officially created, is officially 2 years old. And there are people who are normally employed, who receive their salaries, who receive social welfare. And we are called upon to consult because we have a certain expertise in the sector of training and other matters. And people keep asking me, how did you do it? Well, I just believed that I could do it. But when you come and bring help, even in this course, people say that they're unable, they're fragile, they need support, they need to be raised, they need to be helped to walk, they need this and that. And then there is aid after aid, because the aid you've initially given is not sufficient. And when people ask me, what can we do to fix the system? I want to say, do we need this system? And that is the question I ask of you, Gilles, because Ragnimwendé has just asked extremely precisely what the perverse effects of this aid system are, by saying that donors and those who wish to help are often have good intentions. Do you think they have good intentions? I will ask the question because in the introduction of the debate, you've said that there were power relations and relations of interest between the helpers and the helpees. And are the helpers always well-intentioned? And can we keep such a system?
Je crois qu'on connaît tous le dicton.
I think we all know that the way to hell is paved with good intentions, but
je crois qu'aucun pays
we have a problem in the sense that no country, no community has become richer through aid. It's not how it works. But coming back to the title of the panel today, do we have to do away with cooperation? Well, I think in order to preserve global public goods, peace, security, the environment, and the fight against epidemics, we need more cooperation. We need more cooperation. So I think we do have a problem, because I agree with what the previous speakers said. We need to face our history. We need to face the fact that we need to pay reparations, but especially for the environment as well. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions are the fruit of what has happened in developed countries, but those who are bearing the brunt of it live in the Sahel and in poorer countries. And what Olivia and Uzo mentioned is that cooperation is based on an ideology and on some power relations, power dynamics. And we don't really know what we want to cooperate on. Because here in Europe, we like to think that we fight for universal values. You know, we like to call it universalism. And Suleiman Young came back to these concepts. The way we came up with this universality, this idea of universality, we promoted and tried to tailor-make it to different contexts. But now I think the situation we're in is that we need to co-create this universalism. We need to co-create projects, and we need to remain cautious. And not everything is relative.
Le savoir scientifique, n'importe quel fait peut être contesté parce que
contest every scientific fact, but no, I think we all need to focus around projects that we would co-create together. And I think that is what was interesting in the film. On the one hand, you have the warehouses, you have the cars, which are very well maintained, and then you have chaos in the street, and then there's a huge gap between the two. So I think today, especially with the new technologies, we can do a lot. 2 weeks ago, I was in the northeast of Nigeria, and with the Nigerian Red Cross, we implemented local capacities for displaced people in the Borno state. And we've developed capability to be able to react immediately, saying, well, I received resources, but that's not what I needed. There's this and this event that made me have to leave my house very quickly. So I don't need help anymore. I just want to leave. I just want to be able to make an income and live with dignity. So now, in real time, we can be in direct contact with the people we are working for and receive feedback from them. That is a way for us to put them at the very core of everything that we are doing in terms of cooperation. And everything is in silos. We talk about humanitarian aid because it corresponds to a budget line called humanitarian aid. But I think it's very important to break down the silos and to co-create cooperation on the basis not of this overarching universalism, but to something more cross-cutting.
To sort of challenge you a bit, Gil, is just this idea, I think going back to this idea of aid again, which is, we talk about aid as going from, from rich countries to poor countries, but what if we recast what happened to, in the initial sort of phase of wealth accumulation as aid, right? So as opposed to casting it as work or whatever it is that, like white countries like to say that they did, right? What if we said, no, actually you were aided in the development of your societies by us on the continent or by people who were enslaved? That the terms matter quite a bit, and so if you change the valence of the term, you change the nature of the discussion, and I think that's a really important thing to think about, because again, the intellectual framework in which we're having the discussion has the terms as like defined in a certain way to sort of consistently devalue the inputs or the presence of a certain set of people. So that's the one thing I would say on that, and then the second point that I would kind of make is to really think about the levels and the distinctions, right? So there is, which I don't know that we've really set out. I mean, you mentioned it a little bit, but I think it's really important. There's the personal level of providing for oneself growth and development, which Ragnimwendé, I think you were talking about, which is really important. I think that's one level of existence that we're all talking about. There's which systems of which can be destroyed, as we saw in the film, very easily, and I think you spoke to it very clearly, which can be destroyed by this larger superstructure that we're looking at, which is the sort of country to country level, nation state or region to region level of transfer, right, of wealth or money or whatever. And I think that I often say this, I don't really have that much of a problem. If somebody comes out and says, very clearly says that this is a tool of our foreign policy, which is very much stated in the aid that's given, for example, to Egypt, that's given to Israel, that's now being given to the Ukraine, that was given to Europe, during the Marshall Plan. This was aid as a tool of foreign policy. What that says, and I think it's really interesting, is that says that I consider you to be an equal, right? As in, you are a country that can develop strategies, you are a country that has potential to change or dramatically reorder the world. You are a country or a set of people who has a whole history and philosophy and a way of thinking. And I think that, so I almost, it's call it what it is. It's like, I want influence in this place, and I know that you're somebody who can influence the world, so I'll give you this, we'll do an exchange, right? So I provide you $3 billion, you either order or disorder a section of the world that I need ordered or disordered for my own benefit, right? And I say this particularly in the context of, aid or exchange, loans that are given to places in the Middle East. What I find really kind of problematic is the same situation happens in our sections of the world, right? I'll take Nigeria, West Africa. The French will come and say they're giving aid. What the French are doing is actually trying to order or disorder a portion of the world that benefits their interests. The British will come and do the same, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And I'm saying, so let's have that discussion about foreign policy policy tools and call it that. This is a foreign policy tool, right? And not a discussion about aid or not a discussion about, transfer for the betterment of humanity. It's not for the betterment of humanity. It's for my own purpose and individual gain. I'll have that discussion any day and then we'll trade, right? We'll go back and forth, we'll negotiate as equals. It's when you add in that when you're not clear about the valence, or when you purposefully obscure the definition or valence of the term, that we get into an absurd discussion about I don't know, whatever it is we're talking about. Why are we here? And cooperation, right? I just it eats at me. To the point where you almost want to just be like, all right, well, y'all have the discussion, I'll be over here, doing what I do, because it's not a real discussion. It's not a discussion. It's a discussion that insults someone's intelligence and insults the whole intelligence of a people. And I think that's what the film is trying to suggest and show, right? We're out here insulting people's intelligence, right? As opposed to affirming their existence and their intelligence and their ability to speak in this, and add to the debate that's happening. And that's just, it's I don't know. I mean, you can hear it in my voice, so I'm going to stop.
J'aimerais dire quelque chose, si vous me le permettez, en fait.
I'd like to add something.
Parce que
I really like hearing you. The way you present things, I think it echoes what we heard this morning, because at 10 o'clock this morning, we're in another debate. It is important to clearly define the terms we're using if we want to make sure that we can understand each other, because we keep talking about development aid, cooperation, but do we all have the same vision of the same understanding of these terms? Because if we don't agree on the definition of the terms, everyone thinks they're right. You've given your point of view, I've given mine, and then life goes on. But what is development? What is development? We need to ask ourselves that question. And what's interesting is that I don't need to share the same definition as that which is used by the most recognized institutions in the world. Because if it's just about that, it is shocking that after decades, centuries, there's still populations that haven't achieved their development. So if we're already developed, what do you still have to develop? I think you need to bring it back to a context of constant progress that is happening around us. There is constant progress in the way we think, in the way we create, in the way we adapt, because the world is changing. And if human beings can create a favorable context for their own development, then they can develop. And is what is needed for my development the same as for others. If I, for example, if I don't have a washing machine in Burkina Faso and I have one here, does that make me one of the people who are not enjoying development? If I prefer washing my own clothes with my own hands, where's the problem? We keep putting people in boxes. We create the boxes and we try to shove people in the boxes. And those who don't want to get in the box, we say, oh, they need aid. And those who do not want to get in the box, we will say, oh, they are not in line with development, they're not in line with progress. And if we still want to rank things this way, I can assure you, 100 years from now, we will still have developed countries and developing countries. And, in developing countries, there are people who are perfectly happy. So what are we looking for? Do we want all countries to reach this same level of technological progress? Or do we want human beings to be happy? Because this could generate tensions, conflicts. I'm not saying technology is a bad thing. What I'm saying here is that we are creating this world by thinking that what I have, everyone needs. Everyone needs to have. Cooperation is about two or several entities sitting around a table and working together towards a common goal. You know, working together is easy. You just sign a contract and that's it. It's official. Very often, you know, you have ceremonies and everyone needs to be made aware of how official this all is. But do we actually share the same goal? If we're being real here. This is an example that was quoted by one of the participants at the previous event. He was saying that at the onset of the COVID crisis, many rich countries wanted to share this vaccine. Even to go to Montpellier, I had to get vaccinated. But I have to pay for PCR tests. There are plenty of countries who are ready to give free vaccines, but that's it. They provide vaccines, but, you know, malaria kills more than COVID-19 in Burkina Faso. Why can't we provide free vaccine against malaria for Burkina Faso? But the reason for that is that there's no malaria in rich countries. That's the issue. And at the end of the day, some will want to test solutions in regions of the world where maybe you don't have enough scientists or you can't come up with the vaccine. And then you have other people thinking, if we don't accept those vaccines, maybe we'll ask for aid and they will refuse to give it to us. Some people receive aid and they feel obliged to, they feel forced to. If we're in this situation, does that mean that everyone is sharing the same goal? Do we help people?
Question.
Why do we help people if in the future they don't need our help? What are we going to do? We're going to feel a bit idle, right? I'm going to conclude with a very simple example. In Burkina Faso, you know, I criticize a lot of things, but I try to remain objective on what is happening in my country. We have trained a team of marketing specialists in the company. We train them to communicate well, to meet their clients, and to explain to the clients the impact of their solution and so on. The overall objective is to fight poverty. And on the last day of the training, everyone says, you know, now that we have the tools to fight poverty, a participant said, well, we have to be careful. We can't eradicate poverty, because if we eradicate poverty, what will we do then? Are you sure that development aid is about developing everyone? Just imagine the entire world is developed. Then what? Those who are working in development aid, what are they going to do? Aren't they trying to keep the system going? There are plenty of questions that we're afraid to find an answer to, because we know that the answer will create other problems that we are not sure we'll be able to find a solution to.
Faisons attention de ne pas
So, once again, I think we need to remain cautious and not think that what is good for us should be good for others, because we're different. Our tastes are different. Our climates are different. You know, it was 35 degrees when I left. We have to adapt. When I come here, you know, I try my best to stay alive. But, you know, I don't tell Swiss people, you need the sun, you need a warmer climate, because I know that you're used to this. And if we sent you that heat wave, well, you might not all make it. And if I brought the cold back to my country, I'm not sure we would all make it. But I'd like to see that each of us in our respective countries, we do our best to be happy. And that is an answer I would like to bring to someone who asked me the question yesterday. Am I happy in Burkina Faso? Yes. Yes, I am. And I invite you to visit us. Thank you very much, Ragnimwendé. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Uzodinma. And Gilles, I'm sure there are questions in the room. I think we can circulate microphones so that they can ask you questions directly.
Alors, il y a une main levée par là.
Bonjour, Catherine Schumperli, je suis secrétaire générale.
Hello, I'm the General Secretary of a Federation of Development Associations in Geneva, and I would like to shed a light on some aspects of the question. One of our organizations, the Berne Declaration, was founded in '68, and its motto was, it's not about giving more, it's about taking less. So we're already thinking about these questions back then. I'd like to come back to the two parts of this motto. Give more, but above all, take less. The development policies were not mentioned here, and they are essential aspects. They are carried with NGOs in Switzerland. They help create relationships between countries of the global north and the global south in order to make their relationship more equal. If, for example, make sure that Swiss banks cannot accept illegal money so easily, and those are questions which are important with the framework of development issues, and NGOs have a huge role to play on that matter. And our Federal Chancellor made no mistake about this. I think this is a very important point that we discussed today. Second point that I find important as well is how small organizations based in Geneva build their development projects. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but there are three principles. The first one is that Geneva NGOs co-create projects with local NGOs. This is a very important aspect of things because these relationships create connections between people here in Geneva and people who are on the ground. And in my opinion, it's these exchanges, these solidarities that help build humane relationships. Puts dignity in relationships. Another point is that in order to fund a project, we need to make sure that we can leave the country. So we build a project, we help a little, and the project needs to be to keep running. And the third point is that we ask our associations to work with local authorities, municipal authorities, regional authorities, depending on the size of the project, in order to make sure that these projects can remain based on the territories. I wanted to mention these points.
Thank you for your comments. I have one question for you, though, which is one that always comes to mind, which is, it's on the point of not accepting it, like not accepting illegal monies or whatever. And this is something that I have to bring up because I think it's very much tied to all of this. The question I have is what money is legal and what money isn't, right? And I think it's a very core question because up until about a week ago, Russian money was legal, right? And I don't know if it is anymore. Second, when it comes to some of this stuff, and this is an example that I think is really important. So Swiss banks house probably $2, $3, $4, maybe $5 billion worth of money that was taken from, stolen by, Nigerian folks in power in Nigeria, right? And I think it's interesting, right? Because what happened in this, and I know this from firsthand, again, this was something that my mom worked on when she was Minister of Finance in terms of getting some of that money repatriated. To get that money back, right, was like insane, and the conditions attached, right? So this is what it's like. It's like I roll into your house, I see somebody take, like steal $100 from you, like as in I'm watching the person steal $100 from you. That person comes to me and says, "Can you hold this $100?" Right? You say, "Okay, sure, no problem. I'll hold the $100." And now when I come to get my $100 back, you turn and tell me, "Okay, I'll give you maybe $5 back as a test, but first I want to know how you're going to spend that money. You know, like how does that work is the first question. And what's interesting is that then goes into a lot of what of this discussion, right? That's considered part of this these aid flows and this this idea of repairing situations and damage, but it's attached, and it's not money that you could even say that you had from the first place. It's money that you're returning to me, right? And now you're asking me, are you going to use it to paint the walls? Are you going to use it to like do your garden? That's not really anybody's business, I think, is the first thing. So we have to think about like, what do we call legal? What do we call illegal? Like, why is it that? And I think that goes back to the frameworks and systems. And then I think, you know, some of the stuff that you said, it goes back to that question of how do you order systems. And I think a lot of what you were saying in terms of people, in terms of how the Federation does business, I think is really important and really remarkable, right? This idea of cooperation in the truest sense. Like, how do we actually foster these partnerships? How do we foster exchange and of ideas and exchange of material? But I think in that, one has to really think about the exchange of material as a core thing, right? Which is, would you be willing, you know, and again, a question, if I said, I want, I don't know, I'm just going to throw out a number that's real but not real. If I was like, I want $17 trillion tomorrow, and I don't actually want to hear anything from you, right? I just want the money, right? And that's a number that, you know, people have done various calculations as to how much is actually owed, right? If somebody said, I want that money, and then, you know, you can sit and you can do your thing, but I'm going to spend it. And some of that money will be wasted, right? Because people in every society waste a ton of money. Some of that money will be used in fashions that could be considered corrupt. So let's talk about, for example, in the Western world, all the no-bid contracts for COVID vaccines or for COVID, you know, materials, or in Iraq and Afghanistan and the United States, all that money that was just wasted. And some of that money will be used for good purposes. Would people actually be okay with that? Or would that go back into this narrative of we have to supervise through quote unquote cooperative means? And that's something that I think we all have to really consider in terms of some of these ways of partnership and connection with each other.
Peut-être si je puis effectivement rapidement vraiment insister sur ce que...
If I may actually insist about what Catherine Chopel has reminded us, it's the importance of development policies and the struggle that we have here in Switzerland and in other rich countries about the question of coherence of development policies, where we look at the impact of agriculture policies, investment policies, protection of intellectual property, security, and other matters, and to see what we have in terms of, you know, the lack of something better. What can actors of international development do? These are the objective of the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. Those are kind of the reference. And do all of these sectorial policies contribute to these objectives? That is the question we should ask. And we will see that there are many incoherencies, and that policies in themselves are incoherent, and we should be able to reduce these incoherences if we adopt a long-term perspective and we fight for policies that will contribute to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And the research that I've been involved in for the past 5 years is that 8 years ago, we were told that on every Swiss francs, dollar, or euro that is sent as aid, there are actually 2 Swiss francs that come back and that flee in a different way. And then we ask ourselves, as with researchers from Ghana, Asia, Latin America, we thought we ought to work on how to reduce these illegal financial flows. And this comes back to the question that you've asked about what illegal financial flows are. And we are lucky enough to have a great other economist and thinker, African economy and thinker, that opened the academic year in the Institute for Development. And he was reminding us that informal economy is just economy in most countries, in most African countries and elsewhere. And that he was asking us the question about whether the underage children are collecting gold in an informal way and in a non-taxed way. Is it truly illicit? Is it truly illegal? How can we work with mining communities, whether in Burkina Faso or in countries such as Peru, Colombia, and others. And there is a true debate about the epistemologic prejudices that we have and which were developed at the end of the 19th century in Europe and in North America, and all matters that we ought to question in regards to the social and cultural realities of the countries in which international cooperation is deployed. Once more, thank you for your question about the importance of the commitment of government and policies in rich countries about the coherence of their policies. Ragnimwendé, I think you also wanted to add something, and perhaps there are other questions in the room. Do not hesitate to raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone over to you. I would like to speak about an expression which I heard in your question, and I think it is something that could perhaps help us in the sense that these structures are developing actions to accompany others in doing better. You said, when we come and help, we have a time frame after which we hope to pull back. And this reminds me of what we've seen in the film. When do you think it is the right time to pull back or pull out? Do you decide that? Or are the people whom you've come to help, should they decide? Because this is what happens: is we have projects that start, and some projects are, ended at a time that is not adequate because perhaps there are not people who are able, who have received the necessary training to continue such a project, and therefore the project stops, and the possibility that beneficiaries might have had, the only possibility left to them is to forget everything that has been taught, because a new actor will come in and teach them something different. And if you ask ourselves, when you come in, is it truly to cooperate with people? Then I really think that you should think with people about when such cooperation should end. And I would like to come back to help a little. No one in this world helps only. And I say so, and I'm convinced of it. Every time we give to someone, we get something back. We are in a constant exchange. And the fact that we should believe that we're helping the other, I assure you, is a way to valorize what we give more than what we receive. Perhaps do you not need the same thing as the person you are, between brackets, helping. But perhaps you are missing the human wealth, the knowledge that you will withdraw from their experience makes it that you will change as a person, but it is not something that can be quantified or bought. Even when I accompany people in their training, when they come, they say, help me, and I tell them one thing. I said, you will learn from you, but I will make sure that I also learn from you, because it is an exchange. And I think that when we are in that mindset, then certain barriers will simply fall. Certain ways of looking at things will simply disappear. There isn't a single way to look at other people because I take goods because I need them. But on the other hand, another person will draw experience from it, will draw culture, knowledge from it. And this is how we should look at things. We cannot just come and help. Why should we help? Very, basic. If someone in Burkina Faso is not drinking water, how will not helping him to drink, how will that help you? I'm looking at someone in the public. How not helping him will change your life?
Quelqu'un a peut-être la réponse ici pour moi. En quoi?
Can someone have an answer to this? Does it change your life, your daily life, if you do not help this person? Because Switzerland and Burkina Faso are truly far from one another. It's about 7 hours on a flight. I can testify from it. I've just did the trip. How does it change your daily life if you not help this person? But when you decide to come in with a project which you co-create with the person in need, then you learn that there are people who are living in different conditions than yours, and you will learn how they were resilient until the moment you came to help them, and you will learn from their experience. But when you write your report, you said we we've helped people drink water, but are you even mentioning what you learned from such a relation? We do not help, we exchange. Let us be clear so that we can move forward with transparency. We shouldn't insult people's intelligence. We must co-construct intelligence together.
Bonsoir, merci à tout le monde, merci aux intervenants.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to all the speakers. I would like for the speakers to say one word about whether we need to put an end to cooperation. I have very much liked the exchange of which you have spoken. I come from Senegal. I am Swiss. I am French as well. So I see this exchange every day, and it is a word that I want to pull out of the discussion in the question, should we put an end to cooperation? Yes, let us exchange. And thank you, and I await your responses. So Gilles, Olivia, Uzo, should we put an end to cooperation? Well, that is the question. I will not answer with a single word because I find it difficult, but I understand the spirit of your question. But interrupt me if I speak too much. I would like to say that it would be good if we started with a true cooperation or true exchange, something that I haven't seen so far. And perhaps this is, I'm not sure why I'm speaking French, but this will open us to thinking differently.
To add on to some of the things we heard before, I think it's true that sometimes we may be not specific, like who is working with whom. Is it at the level of the NGOs? Is the level of interhuman connection? You know, it's not even about saying, as I said, let's all stay home and not talk to each other. But what I would want to stress is that we do not have this conversation in a political and historical vacuum. So we can dream about kumbaya, we're all equal, and then let's define what cooperation should look like. But we don't have that luxury, because that's not where we start. So if we take the example of the gas in your apartment, the piece that we sometimes forget to tell is that all these neighbors, most of them, already were ganging up on messing with your gas. So they're part of the problem. And then they come and knock on your door and say, I have the solution for you. So if we cut out that part of the story, then it seems that the question of should we end cooperation or not is a technical one. It isn't. It's an ideological and a political one. And that's where, for me, the word repair helps. But obviously, the aim, the final aim is, how do we live together in exchange? And how do we actually acknowledge that it is always exchange and it's never somebody giving more than the other? And the other myth, I think it's really important, is that when we throw around numbers, which I think is quite useful, and if we isolate the question about aid as a thing in and of itself, we forget that the aid and the flipping around of the term aid, if we say whatever the relation was in the past, and it's actually the majority of this world having aided or helped the North to develop, that's the thing that continues in the present. So if we locate that in the past, as if now we again have this fantasy freedom to come to the room and define what cooperation looks like if we all are nice to each other, it's another myth that is reproduced. The starting point is we are still extracting more than we're giving. In that context, in the present, again, the word aid or even the word cooperation is just a lie. And so I don't know how to then answer the question, but it would be useful to make a distinction between what is development, what is cooperation, and what is aid. And development, when the question was posed, I was thinking of, we've made of development something to do with modernization, copy-pasting the West. Development doesn't have to be that. Walter Rodney, for instance, in his book that, is really important to read, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, defines, and I'm paraphrasing, development as people's capacity to adapt to their environment. Yeah, and that's where it then becomes logical that there is not one model of development. But the conversation about development we have today is one in which one tiny part of the world has contributed to the underdevelopment of the majority of the others. So then the question of development becomes something else. The question of aid, that one I would say abolition, let's get rid of it because it's the biggest lie ever. But then what does cooperation or exchange look like? And then I would say I look at the examples today of climate change that was evoked, or even COVID, and we know how political and ideological these things are. Again, we don't start at point zero. We want to cooperate about climate change, let's do it. But we know that not everybody has the same right to speak, to make decisions for others, and some people will have to cut down on how we live, ourselves included. COVID, the giving of vaccines is, again, the biggest insult, and also really an insult on the value of life. But the fact that you have the capacity to so-called give vaccines is because you're sitting on patent laws and other stuff, right? So you create a need through a system of governance of intellectual property rights that makes it okay for you to buy the survival of others, and then you turn around and you're going to give it. So an exchange for me in that context is not just who's going to give more vaccines to another, it's how do we reverse a system in which a tiny minority paying shitloads of money manages to create a vaccine out of the blue sky somehow, and then turns around and is going to be generous. So for me, the questions about cooperation, aid, and development are political, historical, but very much around power. And if we are willing to get rid of this white innocence thing that we love to hold on to, I think we would come up with so many more rich and diverse answers. And also remember, I think we don't need one answer, but we have to stop pretending that we're already at the level of kumbaya. We never were. One word. Sorry, that was so long.
Peut-être, Uzo, vous auriez quelque chose à dire, et je vais...
Maybe, Uzo, you also have something to say, and I will bounce back on the gentleman's question about should we put an end to cooperation. You are saying that we should have something else, reparations, but extremely concrete reparations, reparation on very specific, concrete subjects, climate change, infrastructure, etc. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about that so we may clarify this question of reparation, which is not always obvious in everyone's mind?
Simple answer to your question.
Et donc la question, pardon.
Do away with this? I would say yes. And so it's, that question, if you tear this wicked system down, what do you build in its place? I think we just touched on climate. Climate is a really interesting example that shows exactly how you could do this in a legitimate fashion, and how it would actually benefit everyone. Because people forget that, we talk about levels of growth and people, growing at 7% or 3% or 1% GDP. And actually that growth might be higher if you weren't purposefully intent on keeping people down. So example specifically, in all of the COP discussions that we've had, COP25, COP26, there's been this promise made, which is a crazy promise, right? That, we're going to give $100 billion, a year or whatever for climate mitigation, for climate crisis mitigation stuff, right? So that number, I think, was pulled out of somebody's ass, to be honest with you. But the thing here is one, what are you doing? So climate mitigation, we are going to help these countries adapt to the climate crisis. Now, in that, right, there's a tacit but very mild acknowledgement that, well, for the last 200 years, we've been pumping out all this stuff that has completely created a terrible situation for most of the people on the earth. So again, that, what would we say about 400, or I would say, let's say 700 million people, if you count the populations of Europe and the United States, can have the most fabulous life, or ever, right? So that's the first thing. Okay, so we're going to give you $100 billion a year to pay for all the trouble that we've caused. All right, well, sure, whatever. We're not talking about what did it cost to actually, what was the value of what we extracted, again, labor and also material, to create the damage that we put together. So that's just backdrop. Now, what we actually know, right, is that if you're talking to actually reverse to deal with some of the issues around the climate crisis, especially on the continent, you're talking about $4 trillion. That's $4 trillion worth of investment a year that you would need to do what? To create the systems to necessary to deal with some of the, whether it's mitigation or to develop new methods of producing energy, of manufacturing, et cetera, to actually change, to create a better situation, not just for people on the continent, for everyone. That's $4 trillion a year we're actually talking about. Now, if you stop talking about it as, oh, we're going to give you $100 billion and hope for the best, and we start saying, you know, we're all investing globally, right? You know, on the order of trillions of dollars a year in a particular place to reshape and reimagine our system, you have a very different situation, right? It's not aid, that's actual cooperation, which is saying, oh, okay, you're over here thinking about how do we build solar farms, right? Okay, here's money, like, you know, we're investing in this project together. Okay, you're over here thinking about carbon capture. Okay, how much is that going to cost? Let's build that. Okay, you're over here thinking about we need to install nuclear power plants to provide energy that is not as, you know, carbon intensive. Okay, how much is that going to cost? What happens though is people won't do that, and this is the fundamental thing. Why? Because it's replicated on so many levels that is so insane that it just makes you really angry. If I go and I ask somebody to invest, you know, I don't know, $1 million, $10 million in my business on the continent, like that has to do, and this is actually a real example, right? Because I was involved in this kind of business. I say, give me $10 million so that I can build a solar home system business, you know, in Nigeria. People, if I went by myself, people would be like, oh, well, you don't have the expertise. Oh, well, you don't know what you're doing. Oh, well, we're worried about corruption. Oh, you know, like, and what they're actually saying to me, to paraphrase, is, I don't think you're human enough for me to give you this money. That's the core of it. Now, I go and I partner with a bunch of Israelis and Dutch people, and we go back and we ask for that money. Guess what? 10 million, in fact, it's not 10 million, it's 100 million. Y'all do what you need to do, build these systems. So what I'm saying is that we have to reframe and think of it in that way. So they're concrete examples of how we can actually shift the way that we do this whole transfer of wealth. So leave the term aid out of it and talk about transfer of money or transfer of wealth, transfer of resources, so that we can all live a better life in the future. And again, I go back to what I'm saying is that that can be done in an orderly fashion that we call investment, right? Or that can be done in a disorderly fashion that we call revolution. And it's up for us to decide.
Si je dois répondre à la question, faut-il en finir avec...
If I must answer the question about whether we should put an end to cooperation, I would say that the way cooperation is, yes. Now we are all on the same planet. Whether we want it or not, we will need to do things together. Cooperation induces for us to have, requires that we have the same objectives. And so if it is necessary for us to have the same objectives, let us be clear on the terms of the exchange. We, as someone with a given situation who needs something to reach point B, and someone with a situation C needs D to reach E. We are clear in the exchange. You give me D, and with my C, I'll move to E. You give me such a thing, and I will go from A to B. And at least we're clear. The objectives are different, but we are clear as far as what the exchange is. And if this existed, this would allow for certain things to be better than they are today. We've always said that when we exchange, there is often an overestimation on one side and an underestimation on the other side. A lot of money is redistributed through development aid, but imagine for a minute that the commodities that were sold were paid higher prices than what they're bought for, allowing farmers and producers, miners to receive these salaries that would be necessary for them to change their quality of life. Then we wouldn't need to help anyone. So I think that in reality, cooperation, if it doesn't work, we need to start from scratch in terms of the exchange, and exchange by exchange, perhaps we'll be able to have common objectives and we will be able to cooperate. But as things stand today, with the disparities that exist in different levels of advancements and understanding, it is difficult to have common objectives if we truly want to be honest. It is difficult because while some are simply trying to eat, others are trying to get to space. But can we, in these two situations, demand to have a common objective? No, but we could have some interesting basis for exchange. And if we exchange correctly, if we give the other the correct value, the value that corresponds to what they have invested in the exchange, then I believe that we will be able to create the development that we're aiming for. We will no longer have institutional development institution, etc. All of this will come naturally. But if we have, if there is a disparity, then I think on a certain level, if we do not give the adequate value for things, we will continue to dig deeper and deeper the differences, the gaps, and the bigger the gaps, the less objectives will be common and the less possible cooperation is. So I hope I hope that this was one word. Thank you. Gilles, your turn. Should we put an end to cooperation?
Well, let's talk, let's exchange.
C'est vraiment ce que je retiens là de.
This exchange of gifts and resources, that's a good thing. We also need to face our past and do what needs to be done, and it's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing. What I will take home from this conversation is that the type of cooperation that we've had until now does not work. We need to do it with this paternalism and neo-colonialism that is all too present in mindsets. And I like that you mentioned happiness, actually. Because when I studied economics a while ago, well, happiness, that was almost an insult. There was a taboo word. And now I think it's interesting to see that there are conferences around happiness, economists gathering around a table and trying to redefining happiness. So this is anecdotal, of course, but we need to rethink what we're trying to co-create together. And I think sometimes it's more simple than we think. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we are a bit behind schedule. I don't know, maybe there are still questions in the room. Maybe we can take one last question. I would like to know how many jobs cooperation and humanitarian activities account for in Switzerland? Well, that's a very good question, but I don't have an answer. We carried out studies a while back on how much money and jobs did development aid brought to Switzerland, and we calculated that for each Swiss franc invested in development aid, Switzerland made between 1.4 and 1.6 Swiss francs. So that is a very good investment. Then how many jobs? I don't know, maybe someone in the room knows, but I don't have the figures.
Nous en avons fini avec cette conversation.
Very well. Well, that takes us to the end of our conversation on cooperation in Africa. I think we've all understood that the way it is framed, the way it is thought through, it is problematic, and we need to rethink not just cooperation, but rethink our objectives. What are our objectives? What do we want to develop together? What do we want to do? Thank you all for participating in this debate, and thanks to all of you who are following us online. Enjoy the rest of the festival.